an original MCM production.
Next up is Don Doherty, shareholder with the firm Godfrey & Kahn, who will introduce our program.
Thanks, President Joanne. Today we'll hear from Wisconsin Senator Ron Johnson. Now, regardless of party affiliation, we can all in this room agree that there is a lot going on in Washington, D.C. these days. And for that reason, Senator Johnson will address a variety of topics, including border security, cybersecurity, immigration, health care reform, and tax reform. And if that isn't enough, Senator Johnson will also then answer any questions you may have after his presentation about any topics that he does not cover. So first, some background on Senator Johnson. He was first elected to the United States Senate in 2010 and re-elected last November 2016. Before that, he spent over 30 years applying his accounting education to operating a plastics manufacturing business, as well as volunteering in local organizations in Oshkosh, Wisconsin. He ran for office in 2010 because he believed that the Affordable Care Act would increase premiums and add to America's already unsustainable debt and deficits. Senator Johnson and his wife Jane reside in Oshkosh with their 3 children and 3 grandchildren. He is chairman of the Senate Committee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs, and also serves on the Senate Foreign Relations, Budget, and Commerce Committees. Please join me in welcoming Senator Ron Johnson.
Well, thank you, Don. I want to thank the Rotary Club of Milwaukee for inviting me here, and Joanne and Mary. Start on a nice bipartisan note here. As we were driving up, my chief of staff, Tony Blando, a servant leader in his own right, was really anxious when he found out that Joanne is now the now president of Rotary, because she was so incredibly helpful as a member of Herb Cole's staff when we first took office, and in a completely nonpartisan way did an awful lot just to help us establish an office, because we were just complete newbies in this business. So, Joanne, thank you for your help here, and thank you for your involvement in the Rotary. Yeah. I remember when I was here about a year ago, I did talk about the 4-way test, which is, I think, an incredibly unifying mission statement for any organization. But it really does point direction how we ought to conduct ourselves in public discourse. I think it's often blown way out of proportion, the partisanship in Washington, D.C. As Joanne demonstrated 6.5 years ago, certainly as I see it in Washington, D.C., it's a very collegial place. There's a great deal of respect for each other as members. We pray together, whether it's Wednesday prayer breakfast in the Senate, I think in the House they do it on Thursday. We do have an awful lot of respect, and I think there's an awful lot of true effort trying to find areas of agreement to actually accomplish things. Nobody goes there. Nobody gives up their lives to go to Washington, D.C. for gridlock. You're really trying to accomplish things for the people that send you there for your constituents. Now, that doesn't mean there's not an awful lot of division, and we just saw that in Charlottesville played out. The division within this country is undeniable. From my standpoint, as members of the public, as elected officials, we should do everything we can to tamper down the rhetoric, try and reduce the division, do everything we can to find areas of agreement and unity, because if there was ever a moment in time in our nation's history, this is the moment for coming together to address the enormous challenges facing our society, quite honestly facing the world. Now, from my standpoint, and I want to turn it over to questions and answers as quickly as possible, I don't care what problem we're going to discuss, what you ask me, the number one component of a solution is economic growth. Now, the goal in economic growth is, of course, a goal we all share. We all want a safe, prosperous, secure America. In Wisconsin, in Milwaukee. We're concerned about each other. We are a very compassionate society. We want all of our fellow citizens to have the opportunity to be able to succeed, to build a good life for themselves or family. I truly believe that. So we share that goal. That's a really good place to start. We need economic growth to achieve that goal. And I just want to kind of lay out just the macroeconomic case of what government policy ought to be focused on. From my standpoint, a successful economy has two primary elements. I'll say three, but I'll start with two. Now, let me start with the first. You need security. I mean, take a look at Serbia. Take a look at any inner city where there's too much inner city strife. So you need that safety and security as table stakes for the other two elements. The other two elements is you need workers, you need human capital, you need labor, and you need financial capital. Now, from a standpoint of public policy, we're doing an awful lot of doing way too many stupid things that's preventing us from having the labor, the workforce we need, and we are frittering away capital. I'll start with capital. We have a $2 trillion regulatory burden in this country. Number studies point that out, $2 trillion. You can dispute the figure, but we all know it's massive. Break that down on a per household, per year basis, it's $15,000 per year is the cost complying with federal regulations. Now, nobody writes a check for $15,000. If we did, it wouldn't be that high. We all bear that burden on a household basis with higher prices, lower wages, lower benefits. So if we want better wages, better benefits, if we want more reasonable prices in products and services we purchase, let's reduce that massive regulatory burden. Nobody argues for no regulations. We have to have a common sense level of regulations. The other thing that is frittering away our capital is a completely uncompetitive tax system. We need to reform that. From my standpoint, we need to simplify it. So if we do those two things, regulatory reform, tax simplification, tax reform, making America's tax system the most competitive in the world so our companies can compete with anybody, our workers certainly can, our companies need to be able to. Then you combine that with the human capital that is required. And I hate demagoguery on all sides of the political spectrum. When it comes to a nation of immigrants, the demagoguery, the rhetoric around immigration is, let's put it this way, unfortunate. We need to recognize we are a nation of immigrants. It has made our nation unbelievably strong and prosperous for decades, for centuries. Every wave of immigrant that came to this country, dating back to our founding, came here probably because their countries were experiencing many of the problems we're experiencing here today in America. But they came here seeking the opportunity only America offers. And they came into our country and they did the hard work, the dirty jobs that whoever was here in America already weren't willing to do. That is exactly what's happening today as well. And as I've been on the job now as your U.S. Senator for the last 6.5 years, there's not one manufacturing plant that I've attended, that I've toured, that can hire enough people. There's probably not one dairy farm that can find enough workers to milk their cows. So we need to recognize the reality of that situation. We need a functioning legal immigration system. It's got to be based on facts. It's got to be based on merit. It's got to be based on compassion. All those things rolled in together will provide us the labor force we're going to need long-term, combined with a better education system, focused on providing our children the tools so they can be productive members of our society, so they can actually help fulfill their own personal mission statement embodied in our national mission statement, which I'll end on. As a business person, I give a lot of, as a politician, I give a lot of talks. As a business person, when I talk about our founding documents, I often relate them to business contracts and letters of intent. I'm looking at Don as an attorney shaking his head. From my standpoint, the letter of intent was the Declaration of Independence. The contract, the more complicated thing, the things that most business people really don't read. We do the letter of intent and then turn it over to the lawyers to draw up the thing that's incomprehensible, the contract. That'd be our Constitution. But embodied in our Declaration of Independence, from my standpoint, is probably the greatest mission statement ever created for mankind. You've all heard it, but let me repeat it slowly. We hold these truths to be self-evident. And I just love that. It's just so obvious that all men and women are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator, a pretty important concept. These aren't rights granted by a king, by government. These are unalienable rights granted by our Creator. But we are endowed with these unalienable rights, and among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And as a younger person, whenever I'd hear that, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, I'd always think, life, liberty, those are heavy concepts. Pursuit of happiness always seemed somewhat frivolous to me. The older I got, as I started having children, and I would lay out for my children the goal in life. It's pretty simple, be happy. But also recognizing, what does it take to be happy? What does it take to pursue happiness? It's not very easy. But because of the genius of our founding fathers, because of that concept of a government limited, primarily designed to protect our individual freedom and liberty, combined with, by the way, Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, published in the exact same year as our Declaration of Independence, 1776. Those two concepts, the concept of a limited government with that mission statement combined with free market capitalism, the invisible hand that just magically makes it all together, but that individual in liberty that we must jealously guard, that is what allows us to pursue our happiness, to have the dignity of earning our own success. And I'll end on this note, because earlier in the day I visited a wonderful organization. We have these sprinkled all across Wisconsin and America. This one's called Brook Industries. It's an organization completely devoted to offering work, the dignity of earning their own success, opportunity to those individuals who aren't as fortunate as most of us here in this room, those individuals that are from slightly to severely handicapped. The smiles on their faces, being able to work, having that dignity, being able to socialize is profound. And it is also, unfortunately, true, there's an effort in this country to deny them that opportunity. Misguided. But when you see, again, the joy in their faces, we have to embrace what this land truly is all about. It's that work, it's that opportunity, it's the ability of being able to pursue our own happiness and recognizing that's no easy thing. It's something that we have to fight for, we have to jealously guard every day of our lives. With that, I'm happy to answer any questions you have. Sir.
Out the Federal Appeals Court in Chicago?
Well, we have a nominee now, Mike Brennan, who I think is a first-class judge. It's, by the way, there's a difference. I want to try and make this as nonpartisan as possible, but certainly those on our side of the aisle really want judges, not judicial activists, people who will look at the law, as Judge Gorsuch commented. Applying the law, not altering it. And so from my standpoint, I want to do everything I can to appoint judges, recognizing the fact that I'm not going to agree with all their decisions. Because there's a lot of bad law that I don't agree with, but I want a judge who realizes he's not a super legislator, he or she's not a super legislator, and they will apply the law, not alter it. And so I think that's what we would have in a Mike Brennan. I hope that our junior senator will return the blue slip, so there's a bipartisan support of a real judge, and I think we've got a good opportunity to fill that vacancy. Sir.
If I may, key off the last question and response. My name is Bill Levitt, and I asked this question in the context of one that you read in today's lead article in the Journal Sentinel. It's about running appointment leadership personally, I speak as a past president of the Seventh Circuit Bar Association, and deep disappointment with the fact that Terry having a seat on the Seventh Circuit is the longest pending opening in the federal judiciary with 7 years. And my question is this: in the Obama years, the Republicans made ample use of the blue slip to hinder the appointment process, and you yourself invoked the blue slip to stop the nomination of Victoria Norris to this very position that the president has nominated Mike Brennan for. And I gather now the Republicans are taking, at least appear to be taking, a somewhat different position about the blue slip, and in fact are talking about even abolishing it. And I would ask you how you reconcile your position back then with Norris with your position today with regard to Brennan, and more general question of judicial appointments and the use of.
Sure. Well, since we've gotten into this in pretty good detail, I'll have to give you a history lesson. The Seventh Circuit vacancy was there for a year under President Obama with 2 Democrat senators. They didn't fill the vacancy. The second day on the job, I literally got 2 blue slips, one on Louis Butler, one on Victoria Norris, and I said, well, hang on here. We just had an election here in Wisconsin. There's another U.S. senator that should be involved, consulted on these judicial appointments. And then I tried to work for 2 years with Senator Cole, trying to set up a fair process to give the voters of Wisconsin who just elected a Republican senator input into that process. Unsuccessful. So when Tammy Baldwin was elected to replace Senator Cole, I already had proposed and written up a contract between 2 senators in terms of setting up a commission, which we established, and it worked very well for the appointment, the nomination and confirmation of James Peterson and then Pam Pepper. Again, very nonpartisan. We each have 3 commissioners. Tammy Baldwin, to her credit, agreed to that compact, and it worked very well for those 2 appointments. Then we moved on to the Seventh Circuit, and it's a more challenging judgeship to fill. There's a smaller applicant pool, and the commission did its work. Now our compact called for 4 nominees to submit it to the White House, hopefully, assuming that we could actually find people that would get 5 out of the 6 commissioners' support. Only 2 did. And at that point in time, I was going back and forth with Senator Baldwin in her office saying, listen, I'm willing to revise the compact in this case and just send 2 nominations. What happened was Senator Baldwin sent 8. She sent 8 people that applied. And again, I have to be very open and honest. At least one of those applicants got 0 votes. So that was a violation of a compact between 2 senators that could have put people's reputation at risk. Think about it. Had President Obama selected one of those individuals that got 1 or 2 or 0 votes, what was I supposed to do? Go ahead and submit the blue slip, or say, I can't because this person got 0 votes? I could have ruined somebody's reputation. So that violation, that breach of that contract, was an incredibly serious problem, which delayed, quite honestly, the nomination, and the confirmation never occurred with Don Schott, who, by the way, I returned his blue slip. By the way, Don Schott was a contributor to my opponent in the last election. I still returned the blue slip. Now, what has changed in terms of the blue slip? First of all, how the blue slip has been handled has changed over history. The fact that it was an outright veto to the process is just really pretty short in terms of historical precedent. Normally, it would be a way for a U.S. Senator to voice his or her displeasure for a nominee, go to the Senate floor, but not stop the process. What changed completely about the blue slip, certainly since I've been in office, is Harry Reid broke the rules of the Senate, changed the rules of the Senate. It never happened before where the rules of the Senate were changed with just 51 votes. Historically, precedent was 67 votes at the beginning of a new congressional session. So when Harry Reid did that, and our junior senator supported him and voted for that breaking of the rules to change the rules, now all of a sudden nominations are just 51 votes. There's no 60-vote threshold on nominations. So the power of a minority to prevent the confirmation of a judge is no longer there. And so the blue slip has no impact. There's no way to enforce holding of the blue slip. So it's completely changed based on Harry Reid employing the nuclear option, changing the precedent of the United States Senate that you can now change the rules with just 51 votes. I think that long term is going to be very negative for the United States Senate, but that's what Harry Reid did, and that's why the whole handling of the blue slip has completely changed forever. Okay? Ma'am.
I'd like to change subjects just a little bit to the Affordable Care Act. I owned a small business many, many years ago. Ended up with a serious health issue. My insurance dropped me. The high-risk pool in Wisconsin was ridiculous. I know Brian thinks it was great. It was not. It was totally unaffordable and covered next to nothing. I had to go back and work for somebody else so that I could get health insurance. It wasn't until the Affordable Care Act came around that me, as an entrepreneur, was able to go back into business for myself and have health insurance. I know the Affordable Care Act needs a lot of work. There's no question about that. But when our president says, let it implode, as an entrepreneur and someone who can't get insurance elsewhere and high-risk pool wouldn't work, how do you respond to that comment about let it implode?
Well, I don't agree with it. I'm doing everything I can to repair the damage done by Obamacare, acknowledge the good that has been done, but repair the specific damage done, and then transition to a system that actually works. That's been my message really for quite some time. It ought to direct our action. Now, let me dispute a little bit in terms of high-risk pools. I've got a fair amount of experience with high-risk pools myself, being a manager of a business that utilized that when an employee of ours in a renewal process would be lasered out of the plan. So we could renew our coverage, but they just wouldn't cover this individual with a high-cost condition. That individual automatically qualified for the high-risk insurance pool, and what I found, again, I wasn't a huge group, but the premiums for very comparable coverage, same level of deductible, same level of out-of-pocket. Again, this is my specific experience. I understand. Go back and take a look at premiums in the high-risk pool prior to Obamacare to what people are in the individual market paying today. Incredibly reasonable with much lower deductibles. But anyway, my experience was very comparable to what I was paying for my group. So we would just immediately transfer that individual into the high-risk pool. We would pay for their premiums, and it really was like no difference whatsoever. Maine, passed guaranteed issue. The problem with guaranteed issue, the problem with covering people with pre-existing conditions is that in an insurance market, just like in auto insurance or property casualty, if you force an insurance company to sell to somebody who just totaled their car or their house just burned down, first of all, who would ever buy insurance until that happened? The same kind of dynamic occurs with guaranteed issue with health insurance. Now, the good news is you can cover people with high-cost, pre-existing conditions without collapsing insurance markets. And Maine didn't repeal their guaranteed issue. They supplanted it with an invisible high-risk pool, operated somewhat differently than Wisconsin. But the main point, to bring it all back, the faulty architecture of Obamacare is they are forcing a very small slice of the American population, about a little more than 5%, to bear pretty much the full burden of other individuals on the individual market with high cost and pre-existing conditions. What you need to do is you need to have a financing mechanism for covering people like that spreads it over the entire society, rather than that small pool. The result of that faulty architecture, nationally premiums have doubled, in many cases tripled. In Tennessee, overall, they've tripled, and it's caused by guaranteed issue covering people with pre-existing conditions and community rating. So I know it sounds good, it's politically popular, and that's why the Republican alternative, first of all, was completely inadequate. Because we weren't honest, we weren't courageous enough to look at that root cause and design a architecture that worked better so that the people that President Bill Clinton talked about, the folks busting it, I call them the forgotten men and women of Obamacare. They're out there busting it, working 60 hours a week, their premiums have doubled, in many cases tripled, the coverage cut in half or more, and they can't afford it. So again, I'm happy to acknowledge, okay, 20 million more people are covered under insurance, about 16 million in Medicaid, and about 4 million on the individual markets. Okay, that's the 20 million people who've gained coverage. Part of the problem with Medicaid is that half already qualified for Medicaid, didn't need Obamacare, they just became aware of it, so they signed up under traditional Medicaid, which the federal government funds to about 60% worth. overall nationally. The other 8 million were in Medicaid expansion, which we didn't accept here in Wisconsin. The problem with Medicaid expansion, it is targeted, by the way, paid for close to 100%. It's ramping down over the years, but about 100% initially. Medicaid expansion is targeted toward able-bodied, working age, childless adults. And it's the tens of billions of dollars we're funneling to that population that's putting at risk traditional Medicaid targeted toward the elderly, children, and disabled. So when we're $20 trillion in debt over the next 30 years, at a minimum, it's projected about $100 trillion additional deficit. Something's got to give. We've got to institute some kind of reforms. You've got to put some measure of control. From my standpoint, the best control would be to devolve the management of these things, the definition of insurance, the management of things like Medicaid away from the federal government, and devolve it back down to the states. I'll end on this note. Show of hands. I might have done this last time. How many people here think the federal government is efficient and effective? Well, we got one. Well, but I mean in general. So you're, by and large, in the minor view. How many think it's pretty broken, dysfunctional? The reason by the way, I've asked that question to tens of thousands of Wisconsinites. I've had 100 or a couple hundred people raise their hand. Normally I get the snickers and the guffaws. Doesn't that tell you something? I mean, trust your instincts. The federal government is broken, it's dysfunctional, it's inefficient, it's ineffective. Demand your individual liberty. Demand government close to the governed where it's more effective. You know, I was part of our local chamber. I was the business co-chair of our Partners Education Council. We had the most liberal professors and the most conservative business people. It never came up. There were no political partisan differences in trying to come up with programs to help educate our kids. That's the beauty of local control, government close to the governed. You outsource your compassion, you outsource your problem solving, you get a $20 trillion debt and a projected deficit of $100 trillion, and we don't solve the problems, we exacerbate them. There was such an easier way, a much cheaper way of covering people than Obamacare. And we've got to work, hopefully in a nonpartisan, bipartisan fashion, and transition to a system that actually works. But you got to do it with facts, you got to do it with figures, you got to do it with the problem-solving process. And I was quite vocal, not particularly complimentary to the troops, my side, okay? During this process, this is a complete political process when it should have been a problem-solving process, starting with information, defining the problem, doing the root cause analysis, establishing achievable goals, then working on the solutions, the legislation. What happened in Washington, D.C., and I had to muscle my way into that core group. The discussions were actually jaw-dropping, unprofessional. No information available whatsoever, just you had senators that had a particular policy prescription, and they would argue it, and I'd ask the question, well, how much would that cost? Wouldn't have a clue. So again, I'm just kind of revealing that slight little insight. You do not want to outsource your problem solving to Washington, D.C. Take a look at our $20 trillion war on poverty, or 13 to 22 trillion, name your estimate. Did we solve poverty? No, we've just mortgaged our kids' future. In back over here?
Yeah, Senator, could you comment on your personal view of the Foxconn project? What, do you see any high risk in it, or especially about the wind? Secondly, could you comment a little bit on your Joseph's project?
Sure.
First of all, there's $13 trillion risk, or $13 billion risk on the Foxconn. It's the largest, what I've been told, the largest foreign investment for a greenfield operation in U.S. history. It's a manufacturing capability to bring that to our shores that we don't currently have that I'm aware of. So the question is it worth the risk? And by the way, from a standpoint of the public-private partnership, that's not a bad ratio, 10 to 3. Now the question is, should Wisconsin be the one to bear the full 3? Illinois, their workers will benefit, America will benefit. So, I've certainly made the pitch to the administration that, if things don't quite work out in our legislature, and by the way, I think the questions being asked by a legislator are the right ones. I mean, there should be some skepticism. There should be studies that say this is what the payback's going to be. The payback time really doesn't concern me as much. A lot of, significant investments have a long payback time. What's the overall benefit? So again, I applaud President Trump. Reince, I know, is instrumental in that. Paul Ryan, Governor Walker and his development team, they really did one heck of a good job giving us that opportunity. And that's what we have right now. We have an opportunity that we can seize. Again, legitimate questions. It's a risk. I think in the end, it's probably a risk worth taking. That'd be my evaluation. The Joseph Project, to me, that's an example. I wish we could claim tens of thousands of people's lives have been transformed through work from the inner city here, but I'll take the couple hundred. And it's simply, all the Joseph Project is one pastor. Now we got more pastors. We're starting up satellites up in Wausau and Madison. But an individual that identifies people that are willing to commit to turn their lives around, commit to succeed. There's 4 days of training, 3 hours a day. We basically talk attitude, and we talk about commitment to success. And then we hook them up with wonderful companies. From the owners to the managers to the shop floor superintendents, the people on the shop floor who are every bit as committed to helping these individuals succeed, and it's just working. But it's an example, first of all, that there are great workers here in inner city Milwaukee that can add real value to any kind of work situation, to manufacturing operations. Hopefully it'll start attracting more manufacturers here to Milwaukee, but eventually, hopefully those individuals in the inner city will also understand there are a lot of opportunities around the state. Maybe they ought to consider at least moving to where some of those opportunities are as well. So again, it's to me, still a pilot program, but I certainly appreciate the support of a lot of people probably in this room that have donated to make the transportation available. It's a program that's worthy of long-term support. Over here.
Thanks for joining us today, Senator Johnson. Your so-called viable Plan B has gotten some attention as a possible bipartisan alternative to the border adjustment tax. Now that the border adjustment tax looks increasingly unlikely to get out of the House, will you formally introduce that plan in the Senate? And if so, can you summarize some of the key components of that plan? Sure. As a follow-up to that, can you specifically speak to how that plan might treat pass-through income as it would apply to LLCs, LLPs, and...
Sure. Well, first of all, yes, the legislation is being written today. What I've done is I've gone through the hard work of over the number of months genuinely soliciting input from experts to try and figure out all the complexities and write the best piece of legislation we possibly can. So we met with about 7 or 8 members of the Joint Committee on Taxation with the Ledge Council right before I left, and so we're crafting that so I can introduce it and hopefully start getting co-sponsors. For all those of you who I wouldn't expect would follow this, my basic plan for corporate tax reform is recognize the fact that the corporate tax is not paid by the corporate charter, the piece of paper. It's primarily borne by employees and consumers in the form of lower wages and lower benefits and higher prices. So rather than make employees and consumers pay the corporate tax, let's make the owners pay. By the way, I've talked to Warren Buffett. I say, stick it to Warren Buffett, a true Warren Buffett tax. Lest you think this is too paradigm shifting, 81% of American businesses have their business income taxed exactly like this. So this would completely equalize the tax treatment on business income across all business types. So no longer do you have to have businesses wrestle with, should we be a C Corp or an S Corp LLC? The basic tax structure would be the same. You eliminate the double taxation on dividends, which, first of all, I think provides really bad incentives for a few thousand major corporations to hoard their cash, and then they use that cash in very anti-competitive ways many times. A lot of them organically grow, but a lot of them do buy up their competitors, their suppliers, their customers. That's not good for a free market competitive situation. The benefits of this, by the way, and this is where I think it's gaining a fair amount of attention from liberal economists. Literally, my last meeting in Washington, D.C. was with Elizabeth Warren on banking reform and tax reform. But one of the reasons it's garnering some attention from even liberal progressives is if you think about it, because, by the way, the way you collect the tax is, I define income as operational cash flow, and out of that cash flow, the business would make a 25% backup distribution withholding on behalf of the shareholders of the federal government. So if you're a little old lady in Oshkosh with a 10% tax rate, you'll get attributed $100 of income, but $25 in tax has already been paid, so you qualify for a $15 tax refund. Warren Buffett, on the other hand, is going to have to pony up some more bucks based on what the top marginal tax rate will be. That means investors like Warren Buffett will place a fair amount of pressure on corporations to make more distributions, which are tax-free because all income's already been taxed. I want you all to think about when that money is flowing out to shareholders, to be reallocated in the Adam Smith invisible hand. It's going to be far more efficient allocation, definitely more competitive as opposed to anti-competitive of a couple thousand corporations making those anti-competitive reinvestment decisions. So, I mean, I'm just scratching the surface of the benefits of this, but no, I really think this is a pretty viable alternative, and I know I've already got some Senate co-sponsors willing to sign on as soon as I actually have the legislation written. Scott.
Senator, sorry to put you on the spot, but what do you think is going to get done by the end of the year?
I think tax reform will be. I mean, the failure with Obamacare has put an awful lot of pressure on the administration and Republicans to get serious about this. It may be a more simple tax reform because it'll be easier to pass. I'm hoping my colleagues will be a little more flexible and seriously take a look at mine, but I think that's true. Listen, from my standpoint, the Trump bump is all about, first of all, relaxation of the regulatory burden. You know, at least now businesses are looking at, we'll have a 4-year pause. I don't have to look over my shoulder thinking of a new looking for a new regulation that could cost me a whole lot more money in terms of compliance or potentially put me out of business. That instills greater confidence, but we've got to follow up that regulatory pause. You know, Trump instituted a 1-in, 2-out rule. You know, the agencies, for every new regulation, they got to remove 2. That's a process of subtraction, which is what we need in Washington, D.C. So that regulatory reform will continue. Again, I think because you have 2 branches of government, there will be a check and balance to make sure that environmental protection and worker safety, those things will still be protected. But we do need to certainly reduce that regulatory burden. And I think tax reform is the other key element of getting our economy moving, which there's a great deal of pressure on this administration, I think in Congress, of achieving that goal. So no, I'm actually kind of optimistic about it. And by the way, the effort on Obamacare is not over. You know, we're talking to governors, we're talking to senators, House members about a block grant, different ideas. I mean, the Wall Street Journal just wrote about my request out of HHS to make available short-term, limited duration plans like was available under the Obama administration. He just curtailed those from 364 days to 90 as he left town. So reinstitute those things. That would help those forgotten men and women be able to source some kind of health care. But we're going to keep focusing on Obamacare too, because the problems with Obamacare aren't going away. I think it's our responsibility to do everything we can to repair that damage and fix it, recognizing the benefit that has already been granted because of it. But again, I think I'm getting the hook. Is that correct? One more? Okay.
What are the chances of getting competition among health insurers across state lines and chances of getting corporate?
Well, across state lines is probably lower probability because we would not be able to do that through reconciliation. Again, as I've really studied this, I think there'd be some benefits to competition across state lines. I'd support it. But if you really think about it, the main driving of that increased competition is really different mandates between different states. Just because if you're in a low-cost state, if you sell insurance policy to high-cost state, that insurance product would be priced accordingly. So I think the benefits of that are probably overstated to some extent. That's not the true panacea here. From my standpoint, it really is more freedom and choice, remove the federal definition of health care, push that back down to state regulators, and then let the 50 states experiment based on best practices, good information of what really drives a better health care system, starting with instituting more consumer-driven free market competition into health care to restrain costs, improve quality customer service, do what we need to do to bring down those premiums. That's what our focus ought to be. But again, thank you, Rotary. God bless all of you.
Thank you, Senator Johnson, and my buddy Tony for being here.
An MCM production.